Senator yields back. Senator Lee, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Nguyen-Chuandra, I'd like to start with you. We've been talking about this from a public policy standpoint about what we wish were the case. We have to accept the fact that, number one, this technology emerged in response to consumer demand, correct?
Correct, sir.
People wanted a device on which they could securely communicate. And you have to operate in a world where the consumer demand is saying one thing, and a similar thing is being said actually by policymakers when we are talking in the context of privacy protection. We frequently hold hearings where we rail against companies that fail adequately to correct weaknesses in their system that could leave users of technology vulnerable to having their data disclosed. Isn't that right?
That's my understanding, sir.
Is it technologically feasible for you to provide a backdoor, even if it's a backdoor that is perhaps accessible by law enforcement personnel, or as Mr. Vance has suggested, could be accessible only by, in your case, Apple, by personnel at Apple headquarters without creating a vulnerability that could lead to a breach of data privacy on the part of a user, including a child who happens to be a user?
And Senator, my experience, and this goes not only through my work at Apple, but also my involvement personally, directly with conversations on ways to investigate this concept of backdoors or a master key or these sorts of ideas. And at this time, we can't think of, we've been unable to identify any way that we could create a backdoor that would work only for the good guys. And in fact, our experience is the opposite, that when we have weaknesses in our system, they're exploited by nefarious entities as well.
Even if the practice of law enforcement became one in which they would send you the device and you had to open it up, creating the ability for you to open up would also create a vulnerability for someone on the app side to reverse engineer it and hack into it.
Correct, sir. And that's, as I said before, we did not have the key to read the data before, so we've actually never possessed that key. We always thought that that would be a grave weakness and a point of single attack for many well-resourced entities. But if we were to revert back to the way that it was in 2014, we would be back in the state where common street criminals could get devices, plug them into cheap equipment, and dump the data off of anybody's phone to steal their identity, commit financial fraud, or otherwise harass any customer.
This would in turn lead to exploitation of innocent victims, including children in many circumstances, would it not?
That's my view, sir.
Mr. Vance, what's your response to this point that if we were to enact a law requiring the creation of such a tool, that that tool would result, number one, in exploitation of vulnerabilities within that system, and number two, just as importantly, would result in people resorting to other technologies, other devices, perhaps manufactured outside the United States, not subject to these same regulations, or using a device manufactured in the United States using a third-party data encryption act. You seem to acknowledge a few minutes ago on that latter point that we still wouldn't be able to get around that.
Senator, breaking down your question, I apologize if I overlooked something. When the telephone companies were told that they had to, in CALEA, agree to a law that enabled law enforcement to have access for a Title III wiretap, they didn't leave the United States. Competition didn't stop. When we told banks in the 1970s that they had to have know your customer regulations and electronic filings and data that they had to provide to law enforcement so we could identify what criminals were using banks where, that didn't end competition in banking. So the statement by the companies that if you do this, it's game over. We are going to be essentially, I would say, economically hurt to the point where it would be bad for the American economy. I think history thus far says that's not the case.
Mr. Vance, it strikes me that the comparison you just made, I mean, it's a little bit like comparing a pen register with a full-blown Title III wiretap. That would actually be understating the difference between the ability to get a wiretap court order and gain access to somebody's device, a device on which they carry their personal information, their health information, their personal communications, their financial transactions. And in many cases, these are devices that are now held by children. However advisable or inadvisable people might regard that, right. Children routinely have these things now. Don't you think the comparison is strained a little bit by that? And do you think it's fair for me to say that the comparison between a pen register and a Title III wiretap understates the difference of disparity that you're talking about here, which is the difference between a wiretap and gaining access to somebody's personal device?
Well, with regard to end-to-end encryption, Senator, if I'm understanding your question, I apologize if I'm not. I believe this requires longer work and direction from this committee and others. With regard to the issue to data at rest, or what the professor calls device data, I have these points. We still don't have an answer to why the lawyer for Apple in 2016 said that with regard to the practice that the company used up until they moved to iOS 8, that there had never been a breach of that process by which they got access to the devices. And if there was a breach, Senator, which I think goes to another point, the question is, what's the risk? Did it happen? Did the breach happen once? Did it happen 10 times? Did it happen 1,000 times? Because you really can't measure which is more important until you understand actually what the harm would be and what the harm was if there ever was a breach at Apple. Because I respectfully can say that on the other side of the equation, there is enormous harm to victims of crime around the country by the inability of law enforcement to access these devices. So was Apple breached when it had iOS 7? If so, how many times? If none, why can't we return to that state? Again, I'm not a technologist, but I'm just going through the experience that I've gone through working this issue over the last 10 years.
Thank you. I see my time's expired. I'd love to have Mr. Neuenschwander be able to respond to that. Perhaps I could take it up in a subsequent round, or maybe one of my colleagues will ask it and allow him to answer.
Without objection,
Thank
we'll
you.
do that.